Do you believe your state is immune to fundamental change? Reconsider that thought. What if the upcoming significant transformation isn't driven by politics or the environment, but by international dynamics? The world is currently experiencing a multitude of significant events, and it's crucial we analyze them closely. Certain states within the U.S. are already exhibiting behaviors more characteristic of Canada than America. They consume Tim Hortons coffee, apologize excessively, and some even passionately support the Maple Leafs hockey team. But this phenomenon extends far beyond mere stereotypes. These states have intertwined economies, shared borders, and coinciding values with their northern neighbor, Canada. As divisions within the United States continue to grow, the concept of secession, once relegated to the realm of science fiction, is starting to feel increasingly plausible. Would your state genuinely benefit from becoming part of Canada? We will delve into this complex question and present our conclusions towards the end of this video. Stay with us as we explore the 10 U.S. states that might just find a better fit under the Canadian maple leaf. Before we proceed, we want to emphasize how much your support means to our channel. Subscribing and liking this video helps us immensely in reaching a wider audience and continuing to produce content like this. Also, we'd love to hear from you. Please drop a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. Your engagement is vital for the growth and sustainability of our work. Let's begin with Washington. This state, often associated with perpetual rain, is humorously said by locals to consider sunshine a myth. However, beneath the overcast skies and verdant landscapes, something intriguing is unfolding. Washington, the hub of tech giants and a pervasive coffee culture, is gravitating northward in ways that transcend geographical proximity. The economic ties are substantial, with annual trade between Washington and Canada exceeding $22 billion. Furthermore, thousands of residents traverse the border each year, fostering deep personal and professional connections. This constant exchange means that for many Washingtonians, the state might already feel more aligned with Canadian sensibilities than American ones. Consider the geographical reality. Vancouver is closer to many parts of Washington than major U.S. cities. Culturally, the similarities are striking. They are practically siblings in terms of lifestyle and values. But here's the most compelling statistic. In recent elections, over 68% of Washingtonians voted in alignment with Canadian-style policies, particularly those concerning social welfare and environmental protection. Their voting patterns and policy preferences often mirror those found in provinces like British Columbia. This political synergy raises profound questions about identity and allegiance. What occurs when economic boundaries become indistinct and cultural lines fade? What remains is essentially a dotted line on a map, a political construct that seems increasingly arbitrary given the deep integration. Ask yourself, would anyone truly notice if Washington quietly switched its national affiliation? The shared values, economic interdependence, and cultural similarities suggest the transition might be smoother and less disruptive than one might imagine. The ongoing dialogue about regional identity in the Pacific Northwest, sometimes referred to as Cascadia, further underscores this potential shift, hinting at a future where political borders might realign based on cultural and economic realities rather than historical divisions. This convergence isn't just theoretical, it's reflected in daily life, policy debates, and the very mindset of many residing in the Evergreen State. Make sure you watch this video until the very end, as we'll be summarizing our key findings and drawing important conclusions about this fascinating trend. Now, let's examine Oregon. Known for its quirky independence and the unique practice of having attendants pump your gas, Oregon presents another fascinating case. This state, independent and quietly leaning towards Canadian values, shares more than just a border with its northern neighbor. Look closer, and the connections become even more apparent. Over 80% of Oregon's exports are destined for Canada, encompassing not just traditional goods like lumber and wine, but also ideas, lifestyle trends, and even legislative approaches. Oregon was among the first U.S. states to legalize assisted dying, a policy mirroring Canada's stance on the matter. The state government actively protects forests, invests heavily in healthcare initiatives, and champions inclusive social policies, all aligning closely with Canadian priorities. The economic entanglement is profound, indicating a deep reliance on the Canadian market. Culturally, the Pacific Northwest ethos shared by Oregon and British Columbia fosters a sense of kinship. Thousands of residents cross the border regularly for tourism, work, and family visits, further blurring the lines. But here's the most provocative element. Canada itself has already engaged in public discussions about potentially welcoming new territories. If a significant portion of the Pacific Northwest, like Oregon, were to express a desire to shift allegiance, Canada might be more receptive than many assume. In fact, just last year, several counties in eastern Oregon flirted with the idea of realignment talks, specifically discussing joining Idaho. But the underlying sentiment of seeking alternatives reflects a deeper restlessness. While the border remains legally defined, the cultural, economic, and emotional connections between Oregon and Canada are undeniably strong and continue to deepen. The question then arises, is Oregon already functionally halfway to becoming a Canadian province? The shared progressive values, the integrated economies, and the historical precedents for considering border adjustments make this a compelling scenario to contemplate, suggesting that the political map might not be as immutable as we often assume. Consider California. The beaches, the tech industry, the Hollywood glamour. It's a state with a powerful global image. You might think you know California, this giant sprawling across the West Coast. But what if this behemoth wasn't as firmly anchored to the United States as it appears? California boasts the world's fifth largest economy if considered independently. That's not a small nation, but a single U.S. state. This economic powerhouse often operates with a degree of autonomy, pursuing policies and international agreements that sometimes diverge from federal directives. Here's the twist. This sun-drenched giant might already be operating by its own set of rules, and Canada has been observing closely. The connections run deeper than many realize. Over $44 billion in annual trade links California and Canada, encompassing goods, services, climate initiatives, cultural exchanges, and cooperative ventures. California has independently forged environmental agreements with Canadian provinces such as British Columbia and Quebec, focusing on carbon reduction and clean energy. Pacts made state to province, bypassing federal channels. This demonstrates a willingness to act autonomously on the international stage when its values align with other entities, regardless of national borders. When California encounters political friction with Washington, D.C., guess who often becomes a key partner? Ottawa. The cultural exchange is also significant, particularly in the entertainment industry, where Canadian talent and production facilities are deeply integrated with Hollywood. In parts of Northern California, the presence of Canadian brands and tourists is commonplace, blending seamlessly into the local fabric. Canadians own property, invest heavily, and even work remotely from California. The line between neighbor and partner is becoming increasingly blurred. Back in 2018, California's then-governor was described by a Canadian minister as being more Canadian than some Canadians, highlighting the perceived alignment in values and policy approaches. This wasn't just flattery. It could be seen as foreshadowing. If the United States were ever to face significant internal shifts or crises, could the Golden State, with its immense economic clout and distinct political identity, consider alternatives? Could it trade the stars and stripes for a maple leaf? Perhaps not immediately, but given the deep economic integration, the parallel policy paths, and the history of independent action, the question of California's long-term allegiance isn't entirely unthinkable. Is it already halfway there in spirit, if not in law? Let's turn to Vermont. Quiet, green, almost idyllically peaceful. Behind the picturesque covered bridges and charming mountain towns, something unexpected is simmering. Vermont might just be the most intrinsically Canadian state within the U.S., and this connection goes far beyond a shared appreciation for maple syrup. Here's a piece of history many overlook. Vermont actually attempted to join Canada once. Yes, really. During the 1860s, amidst the turmoil of the U.S. Civil War, there was serious open discussion about annexation by Canada. While that historical moment passed, the underlying affinity hasn't entirely disappeared, and the idea doesn't seem as far-fetched today. Culturally, Vermont closely mirrors the progressive values found in neighboring Quebec and the small-town warmth characteristic of Nova Scotia. Its population is just over 640,000, making it smaller than most major Canadian cities, fostering a similar sense of close-knit community. Politically, the alignment is striking. In recent elections, nearly 70% of Vermont voters supported policies more in line with Ottawa's direction than Washington's. And then there's healthcare. Vermont made a significant attempt to implement a single-payer healthcare system. Sound familiar? That's essentially Canada's signature model. Although the plan ultimately failed due to funding challenges, the aspiration itself speaks volumes. It wasn't abandoned because the desire wasn't there, but because the small state lacked the scale to implement it alone. Imagine if it weren't alone. Economically, Vermont also fits the Canadian mold, with a focus on small-scale agriculture, clean energy initiatives, and sustainable forestry, priorities shared by many Canadian provinces. Geographically, the connection is undeniable. Montreal is closer to Vermont's capital, Montpellier, than Boston is. Crossing the border often feels seamless, with bilingual signs, notably friendly customs officers, and a rhythm of life that feels distinctly familiar to Canadians. This deep integration, cultural, political, economic, and geographical, raises the question: if Vermont already walks, talks, and votes like a Canadian province, what's truly keeping it American besides the border itself? Now, let's consider Massachusetts. They say the American Revolution ignited here. The tea, the protests, the revolutionary fire. But more than 2 centuries later, Massachusetts might be subtly leaning towards a different kind of realignment, one pointing north. You would be surprised how much this historically significant state aligns with Canadian ideals in the year 2025. First, consider the policies. Universal health care, a cornerstone of Canadian society. Massachusetts came remarkably close and currently leads the U.S. in health coverage, with over 97% of its residents insured, thanks largely to its own state-level system, established long before the Affordable Care Act. Education? Massachusetts consistently ranks #1 among U.S. states for its public schools, often rivaling the high standards of provinces like Ontario. Canadian education experts frequently study the Massachusetts model as a benchmark for excellence. But the similarities don't end at schools and hospitals. The state has aggressively pursued climate action, invested heavily in clean energy, and promoted social equity, initiatives running parallel to Canada's national goals. Economically, the ties are robust, with significant trade and investment flowing across the border. Culturally, especially in cities like Boston, there's a shared intellectual and progressive atmosphere that resonates with many Canadian urban centers. A 2023 study comparing city values found that several Massachusetts cities scored higher on indicators reflecting Canadian values than some cities within Canada itself. That's not just surprising. It's historically intriguing. Geographically, the connection is practical. Driving from Boston to Montreal takes under 5 hours. Crossing the border into Quebec or the Maritimes often feels less like entering a foreign country and more like visiting a cultural cousin. Over 1 million Canadians visit Massachusetts annually, many owning property, running businesses, or attending universities there. The flow of people, ideas, and capital is constant and substantial. There's even quiet, intellectual discourse suggesting that in the face of potential future global disruptions, the entire New England bloc, with Massachusetts at its core, could evolve towards a closer partnership with Canada, not as a conspiracy, but as a strategic alignment. So, the question lingers: if a state's values, policies, economy, and even its people align so closely with Canada, how fundamentally American does it remain in practice? Welcome to Michigan, the state shaped like a mitten, with a literal handshake connection to Canada via bridges and tunnels. You cross one bridge, like the Ambassador Bridge between Detroit and Windsor, and suddenly the accents subtly shift, the currency changes, but much feels familiar. This connection isn't just symbolic, it's deeply embedded in the state's economy and culture. But here's what many don't grasp. That handshake is getting firmer. Michigan shares an astounding 721 miles of border with Canada, predominantly with Ontario across waterways, more than almost any other state. Cities like Detroit and Windsor, Ontario, function almost as twin cities, separated merely by a river and the need for a passport. The economic interdependence is massive, with over $70 billion in trade crossing this border annually. This makes it one of the most vital economic links between the U.S. and Canada, particularly crucial for the integrated auto manufacturing sectors, steel production, and technology industries. But the bond extends beyond dollars and cents. Joint emergency response teams operate across the border for the Great Lakes, demonstrating a level of coordination rarely seen elsewhere. Culturally, especially in the Upper Peninsula, residents often feel a stronger connection to their Canadian neighbors than to distant parts of the U.S. They joke about being forgotten by the rest of the country, but frequently travel to Ontario for recreation, family visits, or even affordable medication from Canadian pharmacies. It's personal. Politically, Michigan voters have recently shown alignment with Canadian-style values by passing protections for abortion access, legalizing marijuana, and investing billions in clean energy initiatives within the last 5 years, mirroring Canada's federal trajectory. A 2024 Regional Values Survey indicated that 52% of Michiganders expressed a preference for a Canadian-style healthcare system over the current U.S. model. That's not a minor preference. It's a significant indicator of shifting attitudes. Given the extensive shared border, the deeply intertwined economies, the cultural affinities, and the parallel policy trends, how long before Michigan's identity itself begins to reflect this powerful northward pull? Consider New York. Skyscrapers, Wall Street, the flashing lights of Times Square. It's the iconic image of American dynamism. We all recognize the brand. But away from the skyline and the relentless pace, New York has another identity, one that's quietly drawing closer to Canada than most people realize. Here's the unexpected headline. New York conducts more trade with Canada than with any other single foreign nation, exceeding $35 billion annually. This isn't just casual commerce. It's a vital economic artery. With over 500 miles of shared border, including 4 major land crossings, and the landmark Peace Bridge connecting Buffalo to Fort Erie, Ontario, this relationship isn't merely neighborly. It's structurally fundamental. The integration runs deep. In border communities like Buffalo and Plattsburgh, Canadian companies own significant assets, factories, real estate, and critical supply chain components. Niagara Falls is essentially shared territory, a major tourist destination for both nations. Toronto, Canada's largest city, is just a short drive away, leading many upstate New Yorkers to spend more leisure time north of the border than downstate. Culturally, the lines blur significantly in these borderlands. Upstate towns sometimes host dual citizenship festivals, and countless residents have family living directly across the border. Language, media consumption, fashion trends, and even support for hockey teams often cross seamlessly. Politically, the convergence is also notable. In 2023, New York enacted one of the most ambitious climate action laws in the U.S., mirroring almost verbatim sections of Canada's federal framework regarding emissions targets and green energy investments. Social programs are expanding, the minimum wage is rising, and public transit initiatives are growing, often following models similar to those in Montreal and Vancouver. A 2022 study revealed that 1 in 6 upstate New Yorkers identified more strongly with Canadian values than with those prevalent in the southern U.S. This isn't just about proximity. It's about alignment in core beliefs and policy directions. If the economic lifelines, the cultural overlap, and the policy parallels are already so strong, what defines New York's identity purely as American? If the bridge is already built and heavily trafficked in both directions, who determines its ultimate destination? Let's explore Connecticut. Polished, subtle, almost blending into the background on a map dominated by larger states and bolder headlines. It's often seen as a wealthy suburb of New York City. But Connecticut isn't just about sipping lattes and managing hedge funds. This small state is quietly forging connections and aligning itself in ways that point distinctly northward, potentially harboring an unexpected affinity for its Canadian counterparts. While it doesn't share a direct land border, Its economic and cultural ties, particularly with Quebec and the Maritimes, are stronger than often perceived. Economically, Connecticut is a powerhouse in sectors like insurance, aerospace, Pratt & Whitney being a key example, biotechnology, and increasingly, green technology. These are industries where partnerships with Canadian firms in Ontario and Quebec are already well established and growing. In 2024 alone, trade between Connecticut and Canada surpassed $3.2 billion, a figure steadily climbing. The real shift, however, isn't just in trade volume, but in aligning priorities. Consider healthcare. Connecticut boasts one of the lowest uninsured rates in the U.S. and continues to explore ways to expand access to care through publicly supported options, reflecting a philosophy closer to Canada's universal system than many other states. Educationally, the state maintains exceptionally high standards, with its top schools often engaging in shared academic research projects with leading Canadian universities like McGill or the University of Toronto. Culturally, there's an influx of Canadian influence, particularly noticeable in the growing number of Canadian retirees choosing quiet Connecticut towns for second homes. They're drawn not just by the proximity, but by a perceived similarity in climate compared to southern states, the quality healthcare access, and a compatible pace of life. The values seem to parallel as well. Recent polling data suggests Connecticut residents increasingly favor policies related to environmental protection, social safety nets, and gun control that align more closely with Canadian national policies than with the federal direction in the U.S. This state, known for its pragmatic and often progressive approach, demonstrates an ability to blend into different systems. If political or economic climates were to drastically shift in the U.S., could Connecticut, with its strong economic base, high quality of life, and aligning values, find itself looking north for stability and partnership? It's not about rebellion, but perhaps about readiness and fit. Now let's head west to Montana. Rugged, expansive, untamed, known for its stunning mountains and vast open spaces. But beneath this big sky country image, Montana is quietly cultivating one of the most intriguing cross-border relationships in North America, and most people are entirely unaware of its depth. Montana doesn't just border Canada. In many ways, it feels intrinsically linked to its northern neighbors, particularly Alberta and Saskatchewan. The state shares over 540 miles of border with Canada, featuring numerous direct crossings. In many remote northern communities, the towns on either side of the border rely more heavily on each other for trade, services, and social interaction than they do on their distant respective state or provincial capitals. This isn't theory, it's daily life. Economically, Montana trades billions of dollars with Canada annually, especially in energy, oil, gas, lumber, and agriculture, wheat, cattle. Some regions depend significantly on Canadian infrastructure for power transmission and water flow management. Cross-border emergency services are already coordinated in certain areas. Culturally, the lifestyles resonate strongly. Hunting, fishing, ranching, a spirit of self-reliance. These are shared values deeply ingrained on both sides of the 49th parallel. It's common for Montanans in border regions to casually mention trips to Alberta for specific goods or services, almost as if the border barely exists. Politically, the alignment is perhaps less obvious than in northeastern states, but a strong emphasis on local governance and natural resource management finds echoes in western Canadian provinces. A 2024 regional values poll highlighted a significant finding. Over 60% of Montanans expressed a preference for local governance over federal control, and nearly 1 in 5 stated they felt a stronger connection to Alberta than to the U.S. East Coast. While seemingly minor, this reflects a distinct regional identity that often prioritizes proximity and shared interests over national directives. Imagine living in a town geographically closer to Calgary than to your own state capital, where your daily life interacts more with Canadian roots and your values align more closely with the province across the line. At what point does the political border feel more like an administrative inconvenience than a true dividing line? Montana exemplifies how shared geography, economy, and culture can create bonds that potentially transcend nationality. Finally, we arrive at Wisconsin. Famous for cheese, the Green Bay Packers, and its Great Lakes shoreline. There's something about the landscape, the frozen lakes in winter, the early morning fishing trips, the small town friendliness, that feels distinctly familiar, perhaps even Canadian. If it reminds you of Canada, you're not alone. Wisconsin might be proudly displaying the red, white, and blue, but look closely, and you'll find maple leaves subtly woven into its fabric. The state shares extensive water borders with Canada across Lake Superior and Lake Michigan, fostering significant economic and environmental links. Economically, Wisconsin's ties with Canada, particularly Ontario and Manitoba, are substantial, exceeding $9 billion in annual trade. Key sectors like dairy, paper production, manufacturing, and agriculture rely heavily on cross-border commerce and integrated supply chains. Some companies in northern Wisconsin cities like Green Bay or Eau Claire depend more on partnerships with Canadian counterparts than with suppliers located just a few states away. It's about fit and efficiency, not just distance. Culturally, there's a shared Midwestern Central Canadian sensibility, a focus on community, hard work, and appreciation for the outdoors. The state's political landscape, while often divided, shows increasing alignment with certain Canadian values in recent polls. Data indicates a rising majority of Wisconsinites favor expanded healthcare access, investments in clean energy, and stronger social programs, priorities that resonate with Canada's policy structure. Furthermore, Wisconsin shares the same latitude as parts of Ontario and Manitoba. Madison, the state capital, is actually further north than Toronto. This geographical reality means winters often feel more Canadian than typically American. Environmentally, the shared responsibility for the Great Lakes necessitates close cooperation on conservation and resource management. The values align too. Recent studies show Wisconsin residents place a high value on community, environmental balance, and public services, mirroring Canadian societal priorities. A 2024 State Policy Match survey ranked Wisconsin within the top 5 U.S. states, whose governance and public priorities most closely aligned with Canadian federal and provincial models. This convergence, across economy, culture, geography, and values, makes Wisconsin a fascinating final piece in this puzzle of North American identity. So, we've journeyed across 10 U.S. states, from the Pacific Northwest's rainy forests to New England's historic towns, across the industrial heartland of the Great Lakes, and into the rugged terrain of the Rockies. In each, we've uncovered surprising and deepening connections with Canada, ties that go far beyond simple neighborly relations. We see intertwined economies managing billions in trade, shared borders fostering cultural exchange, and political values that often seem to align more closely with Ottawa than Washington, D.C. States like Washington and Oregon exhibit strong Pacific Northwest kinship with British Columbia. California operates with the economic clout and independent policymaking of a nation-state, often partnering directly with Canadian provinces. Vermont and Massachusetts embody progressive values and healthcare aspirations mirroring Canadian models, with Vermont even historically considering annexation. Michigan and New York serve as critical economic conduits, their border regions functioning as practically integrated zones with Ontario. Wisconsin shares not only Great Lakes resources, but increasingly aligned social and environmental priorities. Montana's vast border breeds a unique regional identity deeply connected to Alberta. And Connecticut, though small, punches above its weight in key industries and boasts education and healthcare standards rivaling Canada's best. These aren't isolated anecdotes. They represent a pattern, a subtle but persistent northward gravitation driven by economics, shared culture, geographical reality, and converging values. As political divisions potentially widen within the U.S., and as global dynamics continue to shift, the notion of these states reevaluating their position within the Union, perhaps looking towards closer integration or even alignment with Canada, moves from the realm of speculation towards plausible future scenarios. The borders may be lines on a map, but identity, economy, and values are fluid forces. The question isn't if these connections exist. They undeniably do. The real question is, what do these deepening ties signify for the future of these states in the North American continent? What happens when a state feels more kinship with its northern neighbor than its own country? That's the profound question these 10 states compel us to consider. Thank you for joining us on this exploration.